Order, and welcome to this session of the Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, where we're having our concluding session in our Fairness in the Food Supply Chain inquiry. Those who watched this committee will know last week we had the supermarkets in. What we didn't tell people, we had a group of farmers, about 36 of them, and suppliers watching the proceedings remotely, and we went and then spoke to them, and they gave us some feedback about what they heard. And I think in a nutshell, the feedback would be that those at the top of these organisations don't necessarily know what's going on when the negotiations between the supermarkets and the growers, farmers and processors take place. But we're very pleased indeed to have, again, our Farming Minister, Mark Spencer. Could I just apologise for what happened last time? So there was crossed wires, and I know you had to go off to do an SI, and it looked like you were running away from the committee, but we understand that the message hadn't quite come through, that you did need to be elsewhere in the House to take some legislation through. So apologies, and we'll make sure that doesn't happen again.
I've run back today, so...
And also the Nottingham Forest has survived the drop again, so
I'm in good humour.
Perfect. Perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself and the official. I know Minister Hollingray can't be with us because he's got business on the floor of the House, but Alex is standing in for him. I'm sure he'll fill that slot perfectly.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm Mark Spencer. I'm the Food, Fisheries and Farming Minister in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Sarah Everard. I'm the Deputy Director for Innovation, Productivity and Science in DEFRA.
Okay, thank you. I'll start off with you, Minister, if I may.
Alex Williams.
Oh, sorry, Alex.
Sorry, Alex Williams. I'm Deputy Director for Competition Policy in DBT, which, alongside sponsoring the Competition and Markets Authority, Competition Appeal Tribunal, also includes sponsorship of the Groceries Code Adjudicator, as it was previously established under following work from the Competition Commission. And I should also apologise for the Minister's absence, because it's my bill he's currently on the floor of the House taking forward.
Thank you very much. Apologies. I did get up very early this morning. That's my only excuse. Minister, last week the government published the first draft of its Food Security Index. What are the major risks identified in the index and how are you addressing them?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of challenges, which I think we've seen. I mean, clearly, global conflict is a huge challenge, as is climate change and global population increase. But I think we are alive to those challenges. We're alive to the fact that we do need and are blessed with, at this moment in time, robust food supply chains and systems. But we're very much aware that that can be challenged. And we need to put in mitigation methods to adapt and to make sure that we continue to have that robust supply chain, working closely with retailers and processors to make sure the food stays on our shelves.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a look at sort of the assessments, and it seems maybe possibly a little bit complacent given recent global and climatic events. There's a lot of things are broadly stable, some reduction in risk, that sort of comment. It's a bit like Ofsted reports. It's hard to categorise things, but there has been some criticism regarding the definitions and methodology used by the index, which depart from international norms and are not sufficiently rigorous. How would you respond to that?
So I think, it is, of course, very difficult to come up with a very simple system to measure something which is very complex. And global food supply chains are very complex and interwoven. It is impossible to come up with a scale of 1 to 10 where we are in terms of those supply chains. And, for example, how do we measure the amount of food we produce in the UK? Is that measured in kilos? Because I think if we're measuring food production in kilos, then we should just grow cabbage and we'll be producing an awful lot of weight of food. If we're measuring it in calories, then we should just grow sugar beet. But, of course, neither option would actually lead to security of food supply within the UK. So getting that balance right between what we can produce, what we should produce in terms of seasonality, but also making sure our supply chains internationally are robust and secure is the balance we're trying to strike. And, I reject the premise that we are complacent, but I think it would not do any favours for us to highlight too robustly and publicly the challenges we face. But of course, it is very important as a government we think about those challenges and we think about the mitigations we can put in place to address them should those events occur. Because I think, minister standing up saying X product might be short, sure enough leads to that product probably being short. Yes. Because if I declare myself interested, if I say potatoes are going to be short,
they're going to be short this autumn, aren't they?
As a potato farmer, I think you can soon create something that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, understood. And we were very pleased, actually, by the way, that our recommendation for an annual assessment was brought forward, because obviously things have been changing on an annual basis, which is quite unprecedented in peacetime.
Yeah. But I think, as we've seen over the last few years, things can change within a week very rapidly. So, Russia invading Ukraine caused huge ripples around the world for energy and food supply systems. Snow in Morocco at a time of year when we were trying to secure salads caused huge ripples around Europe. So those events can come very quickly. We've just got to make sure that we've got mitigations in place to try and address those.
I think the government is committed to placing the index on a statutory footing when parliamentary time allows. As former Chief Whip, have you any idea when that might be?
I mean, obviously I am sadly no longer the Chief Whip or the Leader of the House of Commons, so don't have responsibility anymore. But I think it's something that's important to the government, so I think it should get prioritised.
Okay. I mean, in the index, agricultural total factor productivity is categorised as some reduction in risks, and agricultural land use is broadly stable. Can you explain how these assessments were reached in the context of poor weather and flooding affecting harvests this year, and claims that many are making that some of the agricultural environmental land management schemes and SFI schemes could incentivise taking farms out of production? I mean, on my farm, I've taken a field out of production because there's a lot of black grass in it. And I thought, well, it's a better that's 20 tonnes a week I won't be producing. Quite a small field, by the way.
Yeah. So if we go back to the 1940s and we look at the amount of land that we were farming back in the 1940s, it's substantially more than it is today. But of course, as an industry, as a sector, we've become much more productive. On an average, we get about 1% more productive every year. We've done that consistently for the last 40 or 50 years. So in effect, we're growing half as much food again on the same amount of land. Or, of course, we're able to reduce the amount of land we're physically farming and use that for other uses. Now, of course, there is a finite limit to how far we can push that. But I think with technology, with new systems of production, then I think that's an ice cream van, but we're probably not time for a break for an ice cream. I think as we get more productive, then we can, we can continue to use land for other things. Now, whether that is leisure or housing or energy production or environmental benefit, what matters is, are we using the best sort of land for the best use? And the land use framework is sort of going to address that as that comes forward, and we can start and think more cleverly, if you like, about what we should grow where and how we should produce food going forward.
And would the location of photovoltaic farms be part of that?
Well, I mean, I think, again, I'm a huge fan of solar panels, but I personally think that the best place for a solar panel is on a roof. I think there's huge opportunity for us to put solar panels on roofs of schools, warehouses, libraries, grain stores, agricultural buildings. Now, what I don't think we should do, I mean, I'm slightly stepping into DLUC territory here, and I'm conscious I'm not a DLUC minister, but I think without being too top-down about it, because if you say no solar panels on agricultural land, then actually there may be a small diversification project which will benefit from a green energy supply that would be blocked from doing that. But I think there is merit in looking at large-scale solar on prime agricultural land, taking that out of food production for energy production. I think we need to think about that as a government.
Yeah. Particularly in places like Lincolnshire, where there's been a lot of applications, understandably. So the next iteration of the government's food security report is due to be published at the end of the year. What lessons will this report take from recent major shocks such as the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine, and what strategies are you putting in place to prepare for future unknown shocks that may come along?
Yeah, so I mean, I think clearly it is very difficult to prepare for the unknown, but I think what we can do is make sure that those food supply chains and systems are as robust as they can be, that we can prepare UK ag to produce as much efficiently as we can here domestically within season, but we make sure that those supply chains are robust. Now, we can do that by investing in our own horticulture and agricultural sector, which is we've recently announced a huge amount of cash going into the horticulture sector. I think it's £80 million extra for farmers to invest in horticulture. That is direct food production here in the UK, and I think there's more we can do in that area to both expand productivity, but also extend seasonality to push the seasons of those products. Drag them a little bit earlier and push them a little bit later.
Yeah, strawberries have been very successful in extending the UK season, as I understand it.
Yeah.
The National Farmers Union has called for all government departments to produce a mandatory food resilience impact assessment when developing new policies. And that might reflect on what we've been talking about with solar farms. To what extent would this ensure greater strategic thinking across government and improve the resilience of the UK food supply chains?
Yeah, so I think, clearly I think there is a role for DEFRA here to make sure, as you'll be aware as a former minister, there is a right round process for every decision that government makes. There's a responsibility within the department that I represent to scrutinise what other departments are doing and to make sure that they've thought that through. So in changing planning rules, if DLUC were to want to change planning rules, we would be able to comment on that. But I think there's also a need for us as a department to think about that throughout the whole of government, whether that's GP surgeries in rural locations. That's something that we should be thinking about, and it's a responsibility we take quite seriously, and we do of course feed into other government departments when they're making decisions.
Things like tax treatment of non-agricultural land use, I suppose, would come into that, would it?
Yeah, but of course they are very much the responsibility of the Treasury, but we of course have a view and would feed that in the usual way.
Thank you. Cheryl.
Thank you. And Minister, this has come at quite an opportune time because I met my farmers in South East Cornwall over lunch on Friday. So some of the questions I'm asking are some that did actually come up in that meeting. The first one is, producers have experienced significant increases in production costs in recent years, but I've heard that processors and retailers have protected their profits and been very reluctant to increase farm gate prices. What steps are you taking to ensure producers receive a fair price? And if I can give you an example, what they told me was obviously they saw a very high increase in fertiliser costs because of the war in Ukraine. But fertiliser prices are coming down, but they've not come down to the extent whereas they meet the pre-Ukraine conflict price.
So I don't think we'll ever return to pre-Ukraine prices for lots of those input costs. But as you indicate, we have seen a return back down from the extreme prices that we saw. But so let me be clear for a start. There is of course vested interest in the supply chain to make sure that there is a reasonable return stroke profit for the retailer, a reasonable return profit for the processor, and a reasonable return for the primary producer. And if any of those three are not economically sound, then the system will fall over. So we have a responsibility as a sector and a supply chain to make sure we deliver that suppliness in the supply chain. Now we took the view that wasn't always working as well as it could, which is why we've stepped in as a government. We did a review, first of all, into the dairy sector because there appeared to be some examples of poor practice, many examples of good practice as well, but some examples of poor practice. So we've legislated to make sure that people get a written contract, that contract is legally binding, that both sides have to agree if that contract is going to be varied, and we've then extended that into the pork sector. And we're about
to legislate. We're going to come on to the dairy and pork specifically.
Okay.
Next.
So that fairness in the supply chain is something that we are willing to step into and make sure that there is that fairness. Now, I think, as Sir Robert was saying earlier, there is a willingness at the top of the retail sector to try and make sure we deliver that fairness in the supply chain, and the question is, are we making sure that's delivered all the way down to those individuals that are tasked with the responsibility of negotiating a deal? Now, I don't think there's a role for government to step into the middle of a contract negotiation and say, you're only paying 48 pence for a cauliflower, you should pay 50 pence. That is down to an individual negotiation. But clearly, once you've agreed a price between primary producer and retailer, I think there is a role for government to make sure that that is honoured and that fairness is then adopted by both sides.
Is there any way that you can send a message to the retailers that they should be expected to pay a fair price?
Well, I mean, I think it is down to commercial negotiation to an extent. So if you, as a primary producer, if you want to, we're picking on cauliflowers, but if your cost of production is 50 pence per cauliflower and you want to sign a deal to sell cauliflowers for 45 pence, so you lose 5 pence on every cauliflower, then that is your commercial right to do that. And I don't think there's a role for the government to step into that level of detail.
Looking at it from the other side, if you can only sell those cauliflowers for 25 pence instead of 50 pence, or they would go to waste, and all the money you've spent producing those cauliflowers is non-existent, it's just gone in the bin, surely we need to make sure that retailers pay the producers a fair price.
Well, but so it's your commercial right to do that deal, but then that deal must be honoured. And of course, as I said earlier, there's vested interest in the fact that the retailer has to have that base market to supply them. And if they don't pay a price that is a reasonable return to the primary producer, then they will vote with their feet. And instead of growing cauliflowers, they may well grow cereals or maize or some other alternative crop, which will leave us short of cauliflowers as a country. Now, the retailers get that, and I think we have seen significant rises in prices, particularly for brassicas, over the last 6 to 12 months.
I mean, if I interrupt, if we're talking about, say, coffee or chocolate or sugar snaps, please, from Kenya, you'd actually see on the shelf fair trade food.
Yes.
I mean, that doesn't seem to be something that applies to British farmers in terms of the same rules.
No, but I think these are questions for the retailers, really, which I'm sure you put to them last week. The question is, where does the government's responsibility sit in all of this? And I think that's in making sure that those contracts are adhered to. Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So I think the fairness in supply chain and the regulations that we're looking to introduce can help in this regard. And part of those regulations also look at data transparency. So we are looking at ways that we can use those regulations to make sure that data puts producers in a stronger position to understand their market negotiation. So particularly in fresh produce, we're going to be looking at those. Now we've concluded the consultation period, but as well in the dairy regulations, for example, where one of the clauses in there that's now coming into force will be about farmers being able to request how prices have been calculated. So in dairy, often farmers are on variable price contracts, but they can request through the now with the regulations for how that price is being calculated at any given time.
Do we know when that regulation is going to come into force? Yes,
so they will come into force for the milk regulations from the 9th of July for new contracts, and from 9th of July 2025 for all contracts.
And is there a possibility of rolling that out to other sectors?
That's exactly our intention.
Yes. So
okay,
we're already thinking about fresh produce, as in brassicas and vegetables. We've done a consultation and we've said we're going to look at that, and we're currently looking at broiler chicken production at this moment in time. And eggs we've done as well.
Thank you.
Derek's next question is about that. Actually,
Yeah. The government has announced new investment to support the UK fruit and vegetable sector, but the scheme will not come into effect until 2026. Why aren't you introducing this support sooner, and what steps are you taking to provide immediate support for the growers?
Yeah, so there's an existing EU scheme which we've adopted, which has continued. That comes to an end in 2026. And so that's when the new, if you like, UK scheme picks up the slack from the end of the EU scheme.
Okay, and we've heard that consolidation by processors has increased their market power and reduced the ability of farmers to negotiate better prices for their products. What are you doing to help producers? I know you've said this with regard to the retailers, but what are you doing to help producers secure a fair price for their goods?
Yeah, so I think you can. I think that has been the case, particularly in the abattoir network. Sorry. So I think we have seen a consolidation within that sector, which is why we introduced the Small Abattoir Support Fund to try and help those who aren't big national players, to make sure that network of support is there to help people who want to maybe secure their own animals and put them through farm retail businesses or to box schemes to give that sort of alternative. It's something that we do monitor, but on the other hand, I think we also do need to make sure those large processors are welcome in the UK. And if Muller want to put in a new factory to produce yogurt or whatever product here, that's good news for the UK dairy sector, because of course it will be British dairy farmers that are supplying that factory stroke processing unit. So I think there's a role here for government to encourage some of those big global processors to make sure that they feel comfortable here in the UK and that they are producing top quality food for global markets here in the United Kingdom.
Thank you. And just finally, during the pandemic, labour shortages in the pig processing plants led to the culling of tens of thousands of healthy pigs. And we've heard that the costs were largely borne by the pig producers. What steps have you taken to address the situation, and how are you encouraging a more proportionate sharing of the risk through the food supply
So I think
chains?
that event is what led to lots of these reviews, which is what led to the review into the pork sector, which has driven that legislation that is coming in terms of pork contracts. Lots of those pig producers didn't even have a written contract. So that legislation will put that right and make sure that we don't find ourselves in those circumstances again.
Thank you. Thank you,
So
Chair.
before I go to Derek, Barry has a quick point. I hope it's
Very
quick.
grateful, thank you, Chair. I wanted to defend Cheryl's brassicas because in that discussion where you were talking about them selling below the cost of production, you used a very strange phrase, Minister. You said you believed that it was absolutely their right to negotiate that contract. Now, most people would think that no rational person would wish to negotiate a contract that is below their own production cost, and therefore they would lose out. So what you're in effect saying, is it not, is that it's the right of the supermarket to compel that farmer, because this is not a free market. This is a market in which the decisions to do this are not unconstrained. And you have your suppliers and you have your existing contracts in with the supermarket. And if at the beginning of the year the supermarket comes to you and their buyer says, well, actually, we're only going to pay you 45 pence rather than 50 this year, you're in a bit of a pickle, because you've actually geared up. You know exactly what you're going to do. You've got your stuff all engaged, ready to go, and suddenly you're being told you can't even get back your cost of production. So it's a very strange use of the word right.
Yeah.
In fact, the right that you're talking about is the right for the supermarkets to exploit the power imbalance between the supermarket and the farmer.
So let me clear that up just to be explicit. So I think number one, if you're a cauliflower grower and you can produce them for 45 pence, and I can only produce them for 55 pence, I would defend your right to be able to sign that contract, which would undercut my business because you're a more efficient producer. So I think we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently lead to lower productivity or increased costs, because that does actually have a negative impact on our own constituents and the price of food in the UK.
That's not what we're considering. We're not considering two competitive farmers competing for the supermarket.
So the point I was making there was it is not for the government to set the price of that contract. So the price that you want to sign that contract at is your business, is not the responsibility of the government at all.
Free market. I'm being forced to buy to accept the price that
you
are giving me.
That's not true, is it? Because I think now, and I think that the supply chain is starting to feel this pressure, in that you do have other choices, other alternatives as a farmer, and I think the retailers and processors are alive to that concern. So you do have an alternative given global wheat prices.
Are you telling me that every contract for cauliflowers that is negotiated before the farmer has brought the basic seeds and planted?
I'm not.
Of course
they're not.
And therefore they've already committed to producing those cauliflowers. But what you're saying is that the supermarkets have a right then to force them now. No. Now they've gone down that path
I'm not saying that
to get less than their production costs.
You're conflating a number of issues. So I think
is what it sounded like.
So number one, I think you identify another challenge in that those contracts aren't long term enough, and we are seeing a fashion towards longer term secure contracts of 3, 4, 5 years, and I welcome that move, because that does give you the security as a farmer to have that confidence. And there's been a number of examples actually of where the practice that you're talking about, where people have already planted that crop and then had that contract withdrawn, where actually those supermarkets
it's
have
not
been
even negotiated
disciplined
by the time you've planted the crop. That's the problem.
So that is exactly the sort of issue that the new ombudsman should look at.
Can I establish the common ground that I think all of us would share? And that is that before the farmer takes a decision on what he's going to plant or she is going to plant in that field, and before they've bought the seed or whatever they're going to buy.
In the case of apples, it might have been 5 years ago.
Then they negotiate a contract with the supermarket, and you're absolutely right in saying that contract can't then be unilaterally reduced. I welcome that. But as long as it's with that foresight, I think we'd all agree, if then subsequently you can't produce at the cost that you thought you could as a farmer, that's your problem, and we accept that. But it's when actually you're not in a free situation, which you would be before you've bought the seed, when you've actually committed to planting that crop, but you haven't yet got the contract, and the supermarket at that stage says, well, we're only going to pay you this much, and it's less than the cost of production. That is wrong, and it's not the right of the farmer to negotiate that contract. You're giving a right to the supermarket to exploit them.
No. But that's exactly the sort of thing that the new ombudsman will look into, and to make sure that practice is driven out. But that, those farmers have also got to take some responsibility as well and make sure that their relationship with that retailer is constructive and productive. And if it's not, then I would put it to them they need to look for another market. And I think
where is the power in that relationship?
So the dynamic has changed. I genuinely think the dynamic has changed over the last 2 years since Ukraine.
You didn't hear that from any farmer, let me tell you, on this committee.
So the farmers that I'm talking to, and there's an awful lot of veg produced in the East Midlands, and I declare some of my interest in this.
Not just talking about veg, though. There's a lot of other things as well, Minister.
Well, we've taken down the
they are
of
struggling.
Vegetables.
They're hurting, and you really do need to take that message away.
Which is exactly
they are
why,
hurting.
But that's why we have legislated. That's exactly why we are legislating. That's exactly why we're introducing these systems and putting them in place. We're the first government ever to do that. And that's why we have taken it so seriously. And I'm enormously proud of the steps that we are taking to help and support people in those circumstances.
Thank you.
Eric.
Thank you very much. So some of this has been covered, but I appreciate it if we can get some more clarity on it. So the government's announced that it will use the Agricultural Act to collect and share the data on the operation of the dairy and pig supply chains. How will this thing? Can you say a bit more about how that will include increased fairness, and can you extend these powers to eggs, horticulture?
So I think yes and yes. So number one, it's about having a written contract, and as I said, in the pork sector, a lot of people have not even got a written contract. We're going to make sure that that is put right. In dairy, for example, which is the first one we've done, we've made sure that that you can only change that contract if both sides agree, and if there is conflict, there is now the ombudsman that will look at those contracts and look at the agreement that's written down and adjudicate whether there is fair or unfair practice. Now, as you've also indicated, it is our intention to roll that out into other sectors. So we've done dairy, we're doing pork, we've consulted on free-range eggs, fresh produce, including vegetables, and broiler chickens. We're currently conducting a review at this moment in time.
Yeah, so on those, then the pig, the egg, fresh produce, the supply chains. You said you'd introduce regulations to improve fairness and transparency. Give us an example of how that.
Yeah. So if I'm a processor and we have a contract that says you've got to send me a pig of 50 kilos, and for no fault of your own, that pig is delayed on farm and gets to me at 51 kilos. I put it to you, it would be unfair if I say that our contract is 50 kilos, you supply me a pig at 51, therefore I'm not paying you for that pig, albeit I'm going to keep it and put it into the food supply chain. That feels like unfair practice. That has and does happen. Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that we want to sort of stamp out.
Yeah, we did hear that from the farmers that Barry's referring to. So on the dairy, so I think the strategy went through in April for the dairy contracts. So if a producer of the milk decides to leave the renewing of their contracts to July of next year, if they already got a contract, is that reasonable and fair, or is there any reason to wait till July next year to review and renew a contract?
No, I mean, I think so. Number one, lots of the processors already in the dairy sector will meet the standard that is expected of them already. And there's some really good examples, particularly in co-ops, where they treat their producers very well, or with good practice. We want to make sure that good practice is shared throughout the whole system. So there'll be those who take a bit longer, but there'll be huge public pressure and political pressure on them to step up. So I'd be disappointed if we have to wait until July 25 before everybody gets there. But that is the legal line in the sand, if you like.
Yeah, and it's definitely welcome. I think dairy farmers are really glad that, and I know they've been quite closely involved in getting something that looks really helpful and good for them. But if I'd received an email from a producer saying that they will use the whole of the 12 months to sort out these new contracts, will the government be involved in applying the pressure to get them to have maybe a more ambitious approach to sorting out their contracts with their...
Well, the legal line in the sand is the legal line in the sand. Yeah. That is the date by which they have to comply. Yeah. But I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of public interest, particularly in the agricultural press, as to who isn't and is compliant with that legislation, and that will lead to a bit of political pressure on them.
The one thing that I've found, because I've been speaking to my dairy farmers, is that actually, unless they're really close to their contracts and how their contracts are drafted, they don't actually know what the implication is for them and how it will change and make it fairer and more transparent for them. How has DEFRA a role in communicating to farmers what they now can expect and what it should mean for them?
Yeah, so I mean we've done quite a lot with the dairy sector with Dairy UK. I think that there is a moment coming very soon. On the 1st of June, we appoint Mr Thompson, who's going to take up this role as the adjudicator. I think there'll be an opportunity then to publicise that appointment and to draw attention to it. But I think, as you indicated, though, it is fairly well known throughout the sector that this is coming, and I think there's always more we can do to advertise that and to make sure people are aware of it.
And finally, we're obviously quite rightly, tightening up on lots of, or introducing fairness and transparency into contracts between the farmer or the, if you like, the farm gate and the producer and the supply chain. But as we've already heard about the fair trade logo, there's this constant concern amongst our own farmers and food producers that they're still on this unlevel playing field when it comes to people importing food into the country. Is there any way that we can address that more in the transparency and fairness piece?
Yeah, so I mean, we're looking at, slightly stepping into Alex's area here, because obviously that's international trade, but I think clearly we do have a responsibility to make sure that the food we import is safe, and we will always do that and have done that. I think practices around the world slightly change, and sometimes it's difficult to put in legislation that fits a global market. As I think I've said before to the committee, free range hen, of course, is a great idea here in the UK, but if you're in Canada at -40, being a free range hen there would be pretty challenging. So, I think we do need to make sure we get that balance right. But Alex, I don't know if you've got a comment to make about international trade.
Yeah, obviously at the last Farm to Fork summit a year ago, the Prime Minister set out 6 key commitments to UK food producers. So obviously putting agriculture up front in trade agreements being one of them. I won't list all 6, but I think a real acceptance there that there is a key role for government in embracing the importance of trade, given domestic production can only provide 60% of the UK's food need. We do need to import, but setting out those 6 priorities, I think, was important. And obviously we've had the CPTPP agreement signed since then, where I think the NFU welcomed the impact those 6 commitments had on the final agreement we've reached there.
Of course, that's why we're also consulting over labelling as well, to make sure consumers are aware of where their food is produced. And
can I just have a brief? So the second ever debate I secured in this place was about food security, but also about labelling, and this comparison with some kind of fair trade mark or a kite mark for British produced food. Now, obviously, we have Red Tractor and various other schemes. As we do, as the department works more and more to create fairness, transparency, but also to inform consumers, it does then need to be one central government-supported kite mark or logo that the consumer really understands. This meets a really good.
So Red Tractor is that kite mark. If you buy food with the Red Tractor logo on it, you know that has been produced to the right standards and welfare conditions here in the UK.
Given that there are other examples, that's the one that customers should have. Consumers have most.
I mean, clearly there are others that exist. So some supermarkets work with the RSPCA and other organisations, but Red Tractor would give consumers the confidence that it is produced here in the UK to the highest standards. And
your labelling one would kind of conclude.
Well, I think it helps. So it's really important to give consumers the right amount of information. Some consumers want more, some consumers want less, and I think modern technology will help with that as we move forward. So it will be possible with various QR codes and things to give people really accurate information about which farm that food has come from in the future.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much.
I'll just ask Alex, one of the sort of issues in terms of equal standards across international trade is the sort of equivalence, and nobody argue, if we're testing our chickens every 60 days for salmonella, and in another country they're testing every 65 days, probably there's no great issue. But who is actually going to be taking that view as to whether their standards are equivalent to ours or actually worse? Because it seems difficult to look at, and particularly in the issue of animal welfare and some of the practices carried out abroad.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not as into the detail of the specific commitments in these agreements, so I'm not entirely sure what kind of monitoring or dispute resolution mechanisms they're subject to. But we can.
So some of it comes down to what is legal and possible under WTO rules. But of course, where we can step in is if there is a human health risk concern. So we would always, or animal health risk. So we will always protect our borders from importing foot-and-mouth disease or African swine fever or some disaster of that nature. Of course, we have a responsibility to do that, and that's what we'll do. But the Prime Minister has been explicit as well that he won't accept chlorinated chicken, for example, or hormone-treated beef.
Understood. Thank you. Rosie.
Thank you, Chair. As we've heard, at the recent Farm to Fork Summit, the government announced the appointment of the supply chain adjudicator, Richard Thompson. Can you supply the committee with more details of his role and, in particular, regarding whether he'll have some powers to enforce regulations under the Agricultural Act?
Yeah, so I think that will be his primary role. That's the power, the Act that gives him that power. I think I want to get him in post at first and let him find his own feet and talk to the grocery code adjudicator and make sure that they're going to work sort of hand in glove, if you like. But I think it is a big step forward. There's quite a lot of work for him to do, in the first few weeks to go and meet people in the retail sector and in the processing sector and in the farming sector, and to make sure that he builds those relationships.
So will farmers themselves and smallholders have a direct kind of line to that office?
Yeah, of course they'll be able to make, if you like, complaints or raise concerns. But I also want him to have the power to go and look at things without that being reported. And I think that's going to be a fairly important part of his role as well.
Have you got any sectors that you want him to concentrate on? Pigs, eggs, fresh produce, or just generally?
So I don't think we want to box him in really into that. I think we'd give him free range. I'm sort of hesitating slightly because I don't really want to keep putting words in his mouth. I want him to find his own feet. And I think too much political interference would be unhelpful. Yeah. I think he does need to have the freedom to go and do and look at and talk to who he wants to talk to, but make sure he's got the power to back up, if you like, to have some teeth and to make sure he can make changes. Sarah, did you?
Yeah, just to add to that, so he, under the Agricultural Act, he does have specific powers that he can enforce, and he can issue fines and penalties. So farmers will be able to raise a complaint, and he will be able to investigate and then take a decision as to whether their enforcement action is needed. To start with, that will be in connection to the milk regulations, but we envisage that we will, for the other sectors where we are conducting the reviews, so for example for pigs, his remit will then be extended to pigs and to the other sectors in due course.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, so for example, if my local NFU came to me with a real problem and they couldn't get help from the Environment Agency or something, could we then lean on him as sort of an ombudsman kind of a role, do you think?
Well,
to maybe get some help there?
His powers will be limited to those set out in the in the milk regulations to start with. But of course, he will be influential in his role. So I think there's a kind of soft power element that he will have. But his sort of legal powers will be those set out in the milk regulations in the first instance.
The price regulation might come into that.
Well, the milk regulations do cover price.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson comes from Aldi.
No, you're confused. So there is that is a common mistake actually. So there is a Richard Thompson who works for Aldi supermarket who is not the same individual. And that has actually caused quite a few ripples during this process where people have accused him before he's taken
one of those ripples has obviously reached the clerks of this committee. Yes, so
let's be categorically clear, it is not the same Richard Thompson.
Probably just as well we've got that on the record now, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Apologies to both Mr. Thompsons.
Yes.
Thank you. Selene.
Thank you and good afternoon. The Groceries Code adjudicator has been criticised for the small number of investigations it carries out and the lack of fines given to retailers. Why has the adjudicator carried out so few investigations, and how are you encouraging it to take a more rigorous approach?
That's for me, I think. I wouldn't necessarily come from a starting point where not using formal investigation powers or finding powers is necessarily a bad thing. I think we've now done 3 statutory reviews of the effectiveness of the Groceries Code Adjudicator. All 3 have commonly found feedback from stakeholders from across the sector praising the collaborative approach and the proactive approach he takes in heading off issues before it even gets to a formal investigation. So I think actually it could be seen as a mark of success of the regulatory regime that there's only been 2 formal investigations since the GCA was established. However, the number of suppliers reporting code-related issues has fallen over that 10-year period on trend.
So we've had evidence here that the levy on retailers to fund the Groceries Code Adjudicator might incentivise a compliance rather than deterrent-based approach by the supermarkets. What assessment have you been able to make of the potential merits of an alternative funding structure for the adjudicator?
I mean, as part of reviewing its effectiveness in its recent statutory review, we consider all aspects of how the adjudicator operates and it is funded. We think actually the levy-funded approach is working well on balance, and that no, it's not necessarily driving it down to a compliance route. I think the assessment from all of the stakeholder input we received was that it was more the proactive approach from the adjudicator and his team and their effective management of relationships with supermarkets and through effective management of the relationship with the direct suppliers that the code is focused on was working well.
But the House of Lords Horticultural Committee concluded that the Grocery Code Adjudicator has limited resources and that its role is too limited to stand up for growers effectively. Will the government consider increasing the funding and resources available to the Grocery Code Adjudicator?
Well, the Grocery Code Adjudicator has been established to ensure the fair and lawful treatment of direct suppliers to supermarkets. So it isn't about kind of producers per se, it's those direct suppliers. In terms of the resources available to the Groceries Code Adjudicator, it's for the Groceries Code Adjudicator to set the levy. It does have Secretary of State approval, but there's never been an occasion where the Secretary of State has not approved the levy that's been brought forward by the GCA.
I think the gap that you referred to is exactly why the supply chain adjudicator is required and why we've introduced that role.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Neil.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being before us today. I wanted to go further into the Grocery Codes Adjudicator. But first of all, Minister, I'm very taken that you are wearing your yellow wellies badge today for the Farm Safety Foundation, and that's something we as a committee feel really strongly about, having published our report on mental health in rural communities. And when we've been doing this inquiry, the sort of inputs that we've had, some of the pressures facing farmers, growers, producers, is that imbalance in the food supply chain in terms of the power of retailers and intermediaries. Now, I'm very cognizant of where government can and can't step in, but I guess you wearing that today shows us that the government takes very seriously fairness in the food supply chain in terms of what that has effects on the mental and physical well-being of our farmers and growers.
Yeah, I think we've all got a responsibility to try and help in that area. I think there's very much more awareness of it. I think there are a lot of charities who are doing a huge amount of work to raise the profile of that, and I think the work that the committee has done has been really helpful to government to shape and direct some of the things we can do to improve that area. So I think that's a really good example, actually, of where select committee scrutiny has helped shape government policy.
Thank you. I now wanted to explore the Groceries Code Adjudicator a bit more. input we've had again onto the committee again is that it could be expanded. So what assessment have you made of the potential merits of widening the scope of the Groceries Supply Code of Practice to give the Groceries Code adjudicator greater oversight of different aspects of the food supply chain?
Yeah, so I think clearly the supply chain adjudicator will work closely with the Grocery Code adjudicator, albeit they are separate systems, and one sits under DEFRA, one sits under DBT, but we as two departments work closely together, and I expect those two ombudsmen to work closely together in future.
Yeah.
Alex, do you want to add anything?
I'm sure Sarah would jump in, but as I say, the Groceries Code adjudicator is primarily looking at the relationship between direct suppliers and supermarkets, and there's aspects of the Groceries Code that are of less relevance than they would be for less relevant than they could be for primary producers, for example. So there's requirements in the Groceries Code around promotions and not charging direct suppliers for promotions, which might be less relevant if you're a farmer, for example. And I think if the development of the relevant sector approaches has also highlighted that you do need to take a sector-by-sector approach when you're looking at primary producers. That's not to say there's not complementarity between the two adjudicators. It's just to say that they are different roles and probably need to be sector-specific when you're looking at primary producers.
Your point there, you said it really that the scope is to do with the direct suppliers to the supermarkets, and certainly when we've had discussions with stakeholders, that's one of the criticisms, is could you not expand it to include some of the intermediaries, because there is a perception that people are getting round the jurisdiction of the Grocery Code adjudicator because of that.
And I've heard that criticism. So
what can we do about it?
So the Groceries Code adjudicator himself has considered the question and hasn't found compelling evidence that that is the case at present. If he feels the code needs to be expanded, he can personally make recommendations to the CMA to vary the order that that affects the code. However, if there is compelling evidence, he has very much requested that suppliers come forward with that evidence. So
it's very hard for people in this sector to come forward in public and actually raise some of these criticisms about the power imbalances with supermarkets. And so that's one of the reasons that we had interactions with stakeholders who off the record can discuss with the committee. It's very difficult to go out in public and provide that evidence, but we can give you a reassurance from the committee that we've certainly had stakeholders express to us they want the GCA widened to help them.
So I think what you're hearing from those stakeholders, they want someone to intervene and to fight their corner.
Yeah.
So we looked at that model, the GCA, and that was one option to expand that model, but it didn't seem to work in the processing sector because it works with a levy on the retailers to fund the GCA. There are 7 or 8 major retailers. There are tens of thousands of processors. So I think that levy model doesn't work, which is why we decided to take it in-house, appoint that individual and fund them through the DEFRA budget and give that sort of autonomy to that individual to step in and fight their corner of those who are dealing with processors. So I think the models are slightly different for that reason, but as long as they have the powers to step in, which they take through the Agricultural Act, then I think we'll get to the right place, and probably with a model that works rather than expanding the GCA.
I take your point then, the difficulties of expanding the GCA. So what about the supply chain adjudicator, Mr. Thompson? Is this something that could come under his brief to actually try and address some of this power imbalance within there? Is
which is exactly what his role will be initially in the dairy sector.
Okay.
But as we introduce more legislation and he then feeds back to us to what he's finding and it'll help him, then there is of course the option for government to introduce secondary legislation to look at other sectors or to intervene in other relationships.
The government is cognizant of these issues. You're just trying to look at the best way of
Yes.
addressing them, is what you're saying today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And finally, in February 2022, the Groceries Code Adjudicator launched the 7 golden rules for handling requests for cost prices increases in the context of rising inflation. What consideration have you given to refreshing the grocery supply code of practice to embed some of these rules?
Yeah, and I think that's what really did cause some of that challenge. If I'd say to go back to cauliflowers, but if we've done a deal whereby we set the price and then there is huge inflationary pressure in terms of energy or fertilizers, then of course that puts you in a very difficult place, and that having that flexibility in the system to adjust those contracts is something which we're looking at and working out the best way. But we do have to recognise if you build in flexibility in one direction, then you risk putting in flexibility in the other direction, and that's something which of course is a huge wrestle. But again, to go back to the beginning, there is an obligation and a responsibility on all parts of the supply chain to make sure that we all get a fair crack of the whip. And if those retailers and processors treat primary producers with, without respect and without recognition that they need to make a profit, then they will not exist in the short to medium term, because they'll either A, go out of business, or B, they'll produce another crop. And that will then leave them as a processor or a retailer without a supply chain.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Barry.
Minister, if 3/4 of your customers were dissatisfied with your performance, do you not think that would be time to think about doing something different?
I think plain economics would lead me to that point.
Good. Well, plain economics would certainly lead me to that point. You will be aware of the research that Which conducted into customers' perception about shrinkflation. Shrinkflation being the process by which your chocolate bar gets shorter, but the price stays the same, or sometimes even goes up. And what Which found was that 77%, it was for different questions they asked, but 77, 75 and 76% said this was basically a rip-off and it shouldn't be happening. Do you agree with the 77%?
I think there are different motivations for that. I mean, clearly one is profit, and one is maintaining your place in the marketplace. But there are, I suppose, some health benefits in reducing the size of chocolate bars or
absolutely,
or
and I welcome all that the government has done and could do more on encouraging people to move away from sugar and so on. But let's stick with this part of it. What they object to principally is the fact that it's sneaky. The fact that it's done without them actually being told that it's being done. And so you go and you get your Twix or your, sorry, I shouldn't be advertising, but you know what I'm,
yes.
Your Mars bar, whatever it is, let's be even-handed here. And it takes you a bite shorter to finish it. And they think, oh, that's funny, because nowhere on the packet did it say, this is now a lot more expensive per bite than it used to be. And that's what they object to. And yet in France, when they did something on this last year, they said, well, who should be telling consumers about this? And over half of the consumers said, well, the supermarket should be telling us. Then I think about 30%, a third of them said, well, the manufacturers should be putting it on their product. Do you know how many people actually said, well, it's for the customer to read the label and find out exactly what weight it was and what weight it used to be? 9%. 9% actually thought that they had the obligation to find this out. Why aren't you doing anything about shrinkflation? If you want to use labelling as a tool, which the government does in some cases very well, surely you should be transparent and make sure that people know that the Mars bar they used to get isn't the Mars bar they're getting now.
So there is a legal obligation on behalf of manufacturers, retailers, to put the weight of the product on the product.
Minister, how many grams is the current Mars bar, and how many grams less is it than the Mars bar before? You don't know, I don't know. I doubt even the head of Mars.
So that's true, but actually, it's probably better for me as a consumer, and I declare my interest as someone who is overweight. It's probably better for me as a consumer to have a smaller Mars bar a day than the larger ones I used to have. Now, do I need to, because the danger is...
It's not the same with baked beans, and it's not the same with a whole load of other products. We've taken Mars bars and Kit Kats and so on, but actually your tin size is smaller, all your packaging, you're getting shrinkflation right across the board, and actually what's happening is customers are being ripped off and they don't like it, and they want the government to do something about it.
Alex, did you want to... defend baked beans tin size?
As a diabetic, I can't talk about chocolate bar prices, but I should highlight that the government is bringing forward new measures to improve unit price transparency. So reforms to the price marking order that will introduce unit pricing by the kilogram for weight and by the litre for volume, as well as improving the legibility of pricing in supermarkets, and we're bringing that forward.
Mr. Williams, you know that consumers are creatures of habit. We go in and we buy the same packs off the shelf because they look the same. What we need to know is when it changes, we need somebody to say, this is actually now changed and you're paying this much more per gram or per kilogram than you used to be. But let's leave that one there.
Larry, if I could just come in there, I think that what was even worse than shrinkflation was this skimpflation that we heard about, where there's less beef in your beef lasagna or less chicken in your chicken ready meal, and they do tell consumers saying new improved recipe, they say, which doesn't quite make it clear what's happening. And we heard about 10 fewer beans in a tin of Heinz baked beans, and they wouldn't admit that the sauce was cheaper than the beans. But that wasn't, that the unit price would not have given that away, because it was still the same total weight of beans. The lasagna was still the same weight, but there was less of the expensive ingredient and more of the cheaper ingredient. Explained.
The question is, in a free market, what is the role of government to intervene in that?
It's to redress the balance of power between the manufacturer and the customer, between the supermarket and the farmer.
And ultimately, the consumer has that power.
This afternoon, Minister, has been about that fundamental issue. Who holds the power, and is government making sure they don't abuse that position of power?
Ultimately, the consumer has that power to make those choices, and we have seen a number of examples where consumer power has driven the market in a very robust... I think free-range eggs is the best example of that, actually, where the consumer decided...
Well, Minister, you and I crossed chicken legs on free-range eggs last time you were here, because you were the minister who was sitting there telling me that actually we should be marketing it as free-range eggs, even when they were no longer free-range.
So, of course, in a situation where there is avian influenza and people are forced to take their chickens inside, there is an obligation to support those free-range farmers during that period.
I mean, support them, but call them what they really are.
Well, I think then we lead to confusing the consumer, not informing the consumer, and that's quite an important distinction.
Look, let's get back to the issue at hand. It's the way in which the customer feels that they're getting the raw end of the deal and that they're being duped by sneaky practices from the supermarkets and from the producers. Principle amongst which is that we now have fake farms. Fake farms. All these... What have we got? We've got Willow Farm for poultry. We've got Nightingale Farms for salads. We've got Redmere Farms for vegetables, Woodside Farms for pork, Boswell Farms for beef, Bay Fishmongers for fish. It's a load of cobblers. It's absolutely fake. Yet you as a government tell us that we want clear labelling. This is not clear labelling, this is lies.
And the question is, how do you then...
They say it's a farm, it isn't. It doesn't exist.
Yes, but you can call your brand... So Mars, clearly, Mars bars are not produced on the planet Mars, are they? Where do you want to go with this? How misleading is the Mars bar? I think you've got to give the consumer some credit for understanding where their food is coming from. And I think there is an argument, actually, that as a sector, as food producers, we've not done enough to keep consumers informed as to how and where their food is produced. And I think there's more that we can do as farmers and as a government in educating the next generation into how and where food is produced, to give them that base knowledge, to make those decisions themselves. Surely that's where government can intervene, rather than in specifically whether you can call your product, gardener's gravy or home farm gravy.
I don't think that either you or I or any other human being on this planet would be seriously confused by Milky Way or Mars or any other product so stratospherically named. But if somebody tells me that this chicken comes from our own Willow farm, then I probably think that somewhere deep in the English countryside there is a farm called Willow Farm that produced this particular chicken. And that is a lie.
So we are actually consulting on labelling. So I accept some of your argument. I think we're probably closer than this exchange is indicating. So I do accept the premise of your question to a certain extent, and I think there is a role to make sure that if a retailer is selling Cotswold chicken pie, that you would expect both the chicken and the pie to have been produced in the Cotswolds. So I do accept that argument, and there is clearly a role for government to make sure that that is not misleading. But there is obviously a huge then grey area where it's quite difficult to make sure that we are informing the consumer and not deliberately misleading them.
Look, I want to leave it because I think I've made the point, but I would simply suggest to you that the consumer, the general public, thinks that this is not acceptable. They think it's bad practice, they think it's sneaky, they think that they're being lied to, and if you set up that dynamic between the customer and the retailer, it's a very bad basis to do this.
It is, but there are other alternatives, of course. So if you go to your local butcher shop, then the size of that supply chain is going to be much shorter. And I think there is a fashion for those that can afford it, because of course we have to bear in mind there's a whole chunk of consumers that aren't in a position where they can afford to go to to the higher end of the marketplace. But you can shorten those supply chains, and sometimes actually those prices are actually quite reasonable when you get there. They're actually you might find beef in your local butcher shop actually cheaper than it is in the supermarket. So I would encourage consumers to genuinely shop about, and certainly that's what major retailers do with all their advertising. Encourage consumers to move.
I would encourage you to encourage them, but I would also encourage you to say to the supermarkets, stop being so blinking sneaky.
Thank you, Barry. Could I just reassure the nation that Yorkshire puddings do not have to be produced in Yorkshire? Indeed, they're our gift to the world. When I was phoned by the Yorkshire Post asking them to give them some sort of geographic identity, I said, no, you've got to make them fresh. You cannot compare a frozen product with a fresh made.
And that is the grey area. So nobody expects a Chelsea bun to be made in Chelsea.
About the recipe.
That is the challenge.
Thank you very much indeed. Kat.
Thank you, Chair. Some consumers obviously are more vulnerable than others, and just to sort of follow on from Mr Gardner's point there, actually if you're watching the grams of carbohydrate in a product that then suffers shrinkflation because you're balancing it against insulin that you're injecting in order to manage your diabetes, that's actually can be a really bad problem in terms of health outcomes. But I've got a couple of questions about unit pricing, and the government obviously has committed to amending the price marking order to mandate that consistent unit pricing, and Minister, you have touched on that already. How do you think that these measures are going to benefit customers? And has the government explored any further measures to improve that clarity of unit pricing so that it's easier for consumers to be able to compare products?
I mean, I think you're straying slightly into DBT area really, rather than DEFRA, but I don't want to throw Alex under the bus.
No, I think I've already kind of touched on it at a high level. So, the CMA did a report into unit pricing that drew heavily on qualitative assessment of what consumers really value in terms of information that informs their shopping habits, and their own analysis of key aspects of our groceries basket. As a result, we accepted the recommendations of the CMA's piece of work, consulted on potential reforms to the price marking order in autumn, and have committed in the government response in January to bring forward a reformed price marking order that will take a consistent approach to pounds per kilo or pence per litre, and improve legibility, and also provide additional clarity on the types of promotions that retailers might offer that should have these unit prices applied to them as well. So I think they've got 3 prongs of our response to that. Will provide additional clarity and will provide consumers with a greater understanding and ability to compare products on a unit price level.
Will this be extended to cover where loyalty cards for certain supermarkets can offer different prices for the same product as people not using a loyalty card or membership card for that said supermarket?
So the promotions aspect will consider that, but I should also highlight that the CMA are carrying out an additional review into loyalty schemes offered by supermarkets and their potential to affect competition in the retail sector, so in parallel track.
It's probably more of a question for the Minister, but does the government look at the way that the supermarkets are currently using their loyalty card schemes to offer different prices for the same products, and which obviously have done an investigation into this where there is some evidence that certain supermarkets are increasing the price of a product in order to then put it on special offer for the person who has the card for that supermarket as a loyalty card, to be bought at the price that it was actually being sold at the week before. Has the government assessed how this can potentially be quite discriminatory against certain customers, because you have to be 18 to have a loyalty card for any of the major retailers? I've looked at Club Cards and Nectar Cards, and there is a requirement to be 18. Surely there's an element of age discrimination that therefore younger shoppers, so perhaps children buying their school lunch in a supermarket meal deal, paying more for their lunch than someone who's over the age of 18 and potentially in work, but also for older shoppers who perhaps are less technologically confident to sign up to these schemes. Are they more likely to be excluded? And it's also worth noting that you do have to have a permanent UK address for any of these schemes, which excludes those who are in temporary accommodation and homeless.
Yeah, I call me old-fashioned, but I just wholly believe in the free market. I think actually having a free market has benefited UK consumers enormously over decades, and I think having that right to go to another shop and to buy a product in another shop is the best way to keep those prices suppressed. And I think UK consumers aren't as... they're pretty savvy. They know the deal that they're getting, and they understand that those sorts of sales gimmicks. I'm not sure that they fall for that, but they make a conscious decision whether to accept or not accept that.
And I suppose that works for the vast majority of consumers, but I'm kind of trying to pull out some of the more vulnerable consumers, and they will be the minority, and the vast majority will probably be able to access a loyalty card scheme in order to access the better prices, but there will always be a minority, will there not, who won't be able to access those.
There will, and of course there'll always be a retailer or retailers who try to take advantage of that market opportunity in saying, don't go to that supermarket because my product is better and more reasonably priced than theirs. And that's how the free market works. And so they attract those consumers across, and that drives down the price. So we all benefit as consumers from that market challenge, I suppose.
Isn't there do you see a role for government when it comes to defending vulnerable consumers?
So, of course, we have a responsibility to make sure people aren't ripped off, but I think we also have the best way for them not to be ripped off is to have a free market that is operating as efficiently as possible, and therefore
if the free market is saying to a teenage parent that they're going to have to pay more for the nappies for their child because they can't have a club card, a nectar card,
yes.
or that the older person who can't sign up online for one, that pensioner who's already living in poverty, wouldn't that be somewhere the government could step in?
Well, so hopefully fairness? There's another retailer that, so if you put your prices for nappies up and then discount them for members, then there'll be another retailer that goes, actually, we haven't put them up in the first place and we're cheaper. And so you'd be able to switch to that supermarket. That's how. And the danger is if you try and legislate that out, then actually the price for all of us of nappies goes up in the marketplace.
It's clear where you're coming from, Minister. So,
so I think we agree that we should try and protect vulnerable people and make sure that product is available to all consumers across society. We may slightly disagree on the best way to achieve that, and my perspective is that the free market delivers that and is the best model, because I think government interference and over-bureaucracy in this area would have the opposite effect of what we both want to achieve and would drive up the cost of products across the marketplace. Alex, sorry, it's your area, really.
I should jump in, because having talked about the CMA review, they're exactly considering what the Minister says about making sure market dynamics are providing that opportunity and choice for vulnerable customers, but their review is also explicitly considering whether certain groups are disadvantaged as a result of loyalty scheme pricing. So they're carrying that work out, and we expect an update from the CMA in July. I think they obviously very much welcome any views from the committee in that space as it
Could I just come in on another aspect of that? Because often people say to me, well, I'm concerned about the loyalty scheme because that supermarket knows every single thing I buy. They know every single aspect of my life. And it may be that somebody's buying incontinence products and they, someone in the household has a problem with that, and they wouldn't really want everyone at the supermarket to know that, or maybe they're buying, gluten-free or diabetic products. So, that is the sort of information they may not want to share with other people. Certainly, if the NHS were to release that information, it would be quite serious. So, is there not an issue that, in terms of the sort of confidentiality of a customer, we're being sort of bribed by these offers to share our lives with the supermarket, who then knows every single aspect of what we do? Oh, they're buying baby milk, there's a baby arrived, let's try and sell them some other products.
I mean, clearly that data is protected under the law. That data couldn't be put into the public domain, for example.
No, but they could certainly use it to market other products that a person might be interested in.
And of course, then in making that decision to use that retailer, you need to do that in a conscious way, that you are sharing that information. Now, that can actually be commercially advantageous to you as the consumer, because you get to hear about those offers and bargains that they put on. But I think most people are savvy enough to work out that these promotions often are to get you in the door, and then other stuff may be slightly higher than it is in another supermarket. And some people are very savvy at working that system. Other people accept the system and work with it. But that's how the free market works. And I think I just think government interference in that area will actually drive up costs and to all consumers. And the free market has delivered a very consistent supply chain at a reasonable price. If you compare prices in the UK to our friends on the continent, then prices of a shopping basket in France and Germany are consistently higher than they are in the UK.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Are you still...
Just one quick final question, which is just about the smaller stores, because of course unit pricing only applies to the larger stores, and less than 280 square metres you don't have to display your unit pricing. But obviously some of the big supermarkets have smaller stores that operate more as a corner shop, but they don't have to display the unit pricing in their stores. Is that something that the department will be looking at changing at all?
I have to come back to you on that, I'm afraid.
Have to get something writing.
But I think, again, as a consumer, you should choose a shop where it displays the price and you can understand that price. I would make.
I suppose the point is that if you're going to your local corner shop that's run by the family in the town or the village, and they don't have the obligation to take on that unit pricing, which would be quite administratively burdensome. But if there is for instance, Tesco Metro that's below that size, that they obviously have this information, it'd be very easy for them to display.
Yeah, I mean that is a commercial decision, I suppose, for Tesco to take. You can't distinguish against them.
Larger Tesco stores to display it, but their Metro stores don't have to. Is there an inconsistency there? It would be quite an easy win for government to actually be able to allow consumers to see this information more accessibly.
Okay.
I'll leave that with you, Minister.
Yes, thank you.
Just while we're on labelling, I always find it rather confusing that we have kilocalories and kilojoules on the packaging. Has the government looked at maybe simplifying and just having calories to make it simpler?
I don't think it's something we have looked at, right? If that's a DBT thing or it just sound like business and trade rather than
I was going to suggest to the contrary, actually.
I'm meeting with the pizza people, and they have trouble getting all the information onto some of the, even though they're very big boxes, getting some of the information, making it straightforward.
It is difficult, isn't it? To compare different products and the way in which we measure and weigh those products. So clearly, you would buy potatoes by the kilo, but
I'm talking about kilocalories, not kilograms.
Yeah. But I'm saying in terms of weight as well. So you would a product like potatoes, you would of course expect to be displayed the price by the kilo, but for a higher value product, say like cheese, you might expect that to be displayed by the per 100 grams because you buy it in much smaller quantities. And I think it's getting that balance right between what is displayed as the unit price is, I think, best left to the retailer. I
think I've yet to meet anyone who actually works in kilojoules if they're on a diet and try to watch the calories when they're having their Mars bars.
Yes.
Well, maybe it's something we could talk about. Barry?
Minister or Mr. Williams, Ms. Everett, can you tell me how many kilojoules there are in a calorie?
No.
In one cake, kilojoules. I do not know that figure.
Nobody knows. That's the point I'm trying to make.
It's 4.18.
4.18 kilojoules in a calorie.
In a calorie.
Did you just Google that?
We are more informed.
Did you just Google that?
Ye of little faith, Chair.
That is impressive knowledge, Mr. Gardner.
But it does reinforce the Chairman's point that nobody has a clue what it means when they read it on the back of the packet.
No. But what I do know, though, as a consumer, I know that Mars bars are worse for me than an apple in terms of energy. So it depends on the depth of knowledge that I need to know, and I do know that having a balanced diet would be better for me than having.
Why are we insisting that the kilojoules go on the back of the packet?
So I think
if in fact we don't need that detailed knowledge,
I think,
and if we need knowledge that we can actually interpret, surely it's important to put on there things that people can actually, in everyday parlance, know what they're talking about.
To be able to compare product with products, which I accept. But so some consumers will want that depth of knowledge, some consumers won't.
I'm going to draw a line under them. Barry never ceases to amaze us, by the way. But we've got the Minister on his feet. So, Julian, if you want to ask the last question, we'll hopefully pull stumps before we finish.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just want to touch, if we can, on labour in the food supply chain, if we can, Minister. So, and we've talked about this before, about access to skilled labour being an issue, the impact that has on the cost of inflation of produce, which came up in the inquiry, and also produce not being harvested and left in the field as well. And we've discussed that with you previously. But what also came up in the sessions we've had, we heard concern that seasonal workers scheme operators are not actually complying with the scheme's requirements, including reports of workers being left without work and therefore unable to repay migration debt. So what steps are you taking with other departments to improve monitoring and ensuring compliance?
Yeah, so obviously this is the responsibility of the Home Office. Yeah. We work closely with the Home Office. So on the number of visas, we've worked closely with them. We're now issuing 43,000 visas per year. The sector didn't take advantage of all of those visas last time, which means that there is capacity for a few more if that is required. But I think you're right to focus on, we do have a responsibility to look after those people when they come here and make sure they are fairly treated. That is the case. The vast number of people that come to the UK are treated fairly, and where they're not, where they're mistreated or they're not obliged, the Home Office does take action and has taken action against suppliers by withdrawing their licence. That's happened.
Do you have those discussions with the Home Office? And
so we meet the Home Office on a fairly regular basis. We're always, we work quite closely with them. They of course are responsible for the treatment of those individuals and are very keen and very robust in our discussions of making sure that we do our fair share and our bit to make sure those people are not exploited, protected and are being treated fairly. And the same in the countries where those people are being recruited from. They do a lot of work to make sure that those people aren't being exploited at the other end of the conveyor, if you like.
Okay. And how do you feel about the companies that are doing the employing and bringing them into the UK? What monitoring is being done of those, and are you involved in that?
So it is the Home Office responsibility again, but there are vigorous rules and inspection regimes in place to make sure that those people are protected all the way through that process, so that there isn't somebody charging them a fee in the foreign country, if you like, to sign up to the scheme, that they're not exploited when they get here, that their accommodation is adequate, that the number of hours that they're working is what they're being paid for. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. It's quite, administratively, it's quite burdensome for the employers, but, employers, if they want to make use of that migrant labour, sign up to that scheme and follow that admin. Because I think, again, within the agricultural sector, we've got some very good employers who really do look after their staff, and a number of examples of where I've gone around as a minister, meeting farmers, meeting their staff teams, and they're often, a foreign national who's settled here in the UK, who's come back on a regular basis, who's been elevated up the management system to fairly high senior roles within the management structure of that business.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. But leading onto the cost part, the Land Workers Alliance has called for the cost of the recruitment and transportation of seasonal workers to be borne by supermarkets rather than actually the farmers. What's your assessment of that proposal?
So I get the supply chain has to ultimately pick up the cost of that product reaching the supermarket shelf. So I think it's something we need to share across that supply chain. And if we're to produce those products at a reasonable price for our consumers, we're going right back to the beginning, that needs to be fair for the retailer, fair for the processor, fair for the primary producer.
I mean, I'll just finish on this point. Obviously, the bell's ringing. But we had the supermarkets in front of us, and they said they are concerned about the fact that of skilled labour for their producers.
Yep.
But then they're also not prepared to actually fund it.
Well, I mean, ultimately, the consumer has to pay for this all lands on the consumer, doesn't it? At the end of the day, and when they buy a product off the shelf, they are the ultimate individual in that chain. But again, the retailer needs to play their part, the processor and the primary producer. They need to share the risk, share the responsibility, but also share the profit.
You think the retailers are doing enough then?
So I think there's always more we can do. I think there's more that we need to do to balance that supply chain, and that comes down again to fundamentally what the government is trying to achieve through its fairness reviews, through putting the Ombudsman in place, and to continue those conversations to keep that supply chain flowing and fair.
Okay. Thank you. Minister, Mr Williams, Ms Everett, thank you very much indeed for coming on and giving evidence. You've been, I'm going to say you were saved by the bell, but we've actually got to the end of our questioning, so that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Order, order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.